Okay, well, thank you very much, and we're now going to conclude.
So, please, sit down. Sit down. The managing director of the IMF is coming. And Christine, you'll have the last word. We organized this international committee for you to have the last word. So, would you care taking, no, perhaps? Yeah, you have stairs. So, Christine, please sit down. As I said, you will have the last word. Christine Lagarde needs no introduction. And as we all know, she's under the sunlight on a permanent basis, at least as long as we are coping with a global economic and financial situation which is incredibly demanding. So what I would only do is nevertheless to mention the fact that you have a fantastic preparation, if I may, for this unique global job. Very unique, because we are in the worst crisis since World War II, and you are the MD having to cope with the worst crisis since World War II. And I trust that perhaps could have been even worse had appropriate decision not been taken. But you were very well prepared, if I may, Minister of Trade, Minister of Agriculture, Minister of Economy, Finance and Industry in France, with, I can testify, great success in these successive positions. You were also the first female chairperson of the law firm Baker and McKenzie in Chicago. And I have to say that this is a double training or double experience, which is, of course, extraordinarily useful in the present circumstances. And I would say that you have also the particular training of having been in the French national synchronized swimming team. From time to time, you make an allusion to that, which, you know, knowing how to swim in all the oceans of the world is perhaps the best quality you could have in the circumstances. So I would only say that you're coming exactly to, again, as I said, have the last word and to perhaps enlighten us on the leadership keys for the future of global economic stability. The idea would be that you would be concise, if you wish, in your remarks in order to let a little bit of room for question and answers. And I know that you have prepared your remarks in that fashion. So, Christine, thank you so much.
Shall I address from here? Well, thank you very much, Jean-Claude. Good evening to all of you. Thank you, especially since I've not been able to attend a particular event that you had organized and which I had to be excused for very, very solid family reasons, which had to do with the wedding of a daughter, quasi-daughter. You'll be pleased to know that since that she's had a baby, so I'm now a grandmother as well, which is wonderful. The other extra curriculum that I would also like to offer, because I often hear that, surprise, surprise, I've been a synchronized swimming national champion. I've given up on synchronized swimming, but I'm now into scuba diving. So scuba diving actually allows me to keep my air for longer, to dive even deeper, and certainly to be better acquainted with lots of nasty fish, which is extremely helpful in the circumstances. Thank you very much for having me, and I would like to also thank Richard Debs for having me and having greeted me. You are both terrific gentlemen, and you handle this event with the talent and the warmth that would have also been displayed in spades by our friend Jim Wolfenson. He sent me a lovely little note before these meetings wishing me good luck and telling me how sorry he was not to be with us, but he also sent me a mail yesterday, maybe he sent it to you all as well, to say that he was a lot better and that he was looking forward to the next event where he could greet me and obviously be with all of us. So it's with a bit of emotion and a bit of sadness, but also good feelings about his recovery that I'm here in front of you. And I have to say, you know, having sort of strolled around this building to find you, I'm very pleased now to be here. You know the place, you know these meetings, you know the institutions, and you know how hectic those moments are, especially for you know, the managing director of the IMF or the president of the World Bank. So it's quite nice to actually be with the family, because the Bretton Woods committee here has always been regarded as supportive and a family for those that are engaged in, as you said, Jean-Claude, a pretty tough and demanding situation. What I thought I would do briefly, to leave space and time for your questions, is maybe to go through very quickly with you as to, you know, how we see the world economic situation and what kind of policies or packages of policies we regard as necessary going forward to try to put the crisis behind us and to try to anchor recovery from the future into the present, if I may say. And then very quickly offer you a few thoughts that I have about the role that the IMF can play and how it has to evolve over time. But starting with the global economy, I'll start with numbers. The good news is that there is growth. 2012 is a year with growth, and 2013 will be a year with growth as well. The gloomy side of things is that it is not as strong as we initially thought it would be back a year ago, and not even as strong as we thought it would be back in April. So the World Economic Outlook includes a downward revision by 0.3%, both in 2012 and 2013, at 3.3% in 12 and 3.6% in 13, with the emerging market economies and low-income countries contributing in the range of about 5.3 in 2012, and the advanced economy cruising at about 1.3, which is significantly less than growth output would allow. So that's the situation as we have it, and it is still the bricks that are going to drive growth going forward, as has been the case in the last few years. Now, the recent phenomenon that we've observed since last April, when we had our spring meetings, is that not only has the situation slightly worsened in the advanced economies for various reasons, but the slowdown of growth in the advanced economies has now been spread around and has affected as well the BRICS countries, and to a lesser extent the low-income countries. So this spillover theory that we have observed with empirical research is clearly demonstrated on the occasion of this crisis, and any idea that there could be decoupling and that the emerging market economies would be just preserved because of their own endogenous development is certainly, in this current situation, a story of the past. Having said that, clearly certain things have happened. And we have seen good developments, certainly from our perspective. Maybe central bankers don't find it so pleasant to be in the spotlight and at the front row of economic actors, but certainly the actions that have been taken by the central banks, whether it's the Fed, whether it's the ECB, whether it's the Bank of Japan, earlier on in the year, the Bank of England, have been critical in providing the adequate volume of liquidity and trying to organize proper transmission of monetary policy, to use the appropriate a la ECB jargon to explain what is the combination of the OMT, the outright monetary transaction, combined with the use of the European stability mechanism, together with possibly the IMF. But central bankers have been at the forefront of action lately, and have certainly been extremely helpful. They recognize themselves, and we agree with that they cannot be the sole players. And obviously, policy decisions have to be made, particularly in terms of fiscal adjustments, by the governments, by the political authorities. That will be music to Jean-Claude's ears, because we had to deal exactly with that kind of situations for the last 3 years or so. And this is still the case. However, and particularly in the euro area, decisions have also been made. As I mentioned when I presented our findings at the IMFC this morning, what is mostly needed now is what I called ACT, which stands for ACT. Because good policy decisions have been made. There is no question about it. Whether it's the announcement of European banking union in the Eurozone, a European fiscal union, more so than what is currently in place, and which is itself an improvement from what they had 3 or 4 years ago. Those have been good policy announcements. Another good development, which is a bit more than policy announcement, is the setting up and capitalization of the European Stability Mechanism, which has seen the light of day officially last Monday. Still in the good development is, from our point of view, certainly the OMT, which allows the European Central Bank to use certain tools with the appropriate degree of granularity in order to make sure that its monetary policy is transmitted to the corners of the euro area empire, if you will, and where it didn't travel so well based on various criteria that we observe as well as they observe. So those are, you know, positive signs, good policy decisions, but clearly there's a bit of action that is needed. That's at the regional level in the Eurozone. At the national levels, in many of those countries, whether they are countries under program, currently 3 of them in the Eurozone, possibly a 4th one with Cyprus soon, but also with countries that are not under IMF program or Troika program, if you will, but that have access to market, but in a fragile and sometimes questioned way, such as Spain and Italy. There are clearly some significant fiscal consolidation measures that have been taken and some structural reforms that are underway. This is certainly the case for Spain, as we have seen it, and yet action is still needed. I will not dwell too much, and you probably know what I can have in the back of my mind in that respect. That's for the euro area, and I'm sure that a few representatives of the UK would be happy to comment on the UK specifically, but I will refrain from that because it's going through a very drastic policy of fiscal consolidation and structural reform. But I will turn to the United States of America, because if we're looking at those tail risks that we regard as having exacerbated and probably accelerated the slowdown in the advanced economies, we find the United States of America with a degree of threats that is probably not factored in by the markets, but which is still a source of uncertainty and worries on the part of the economic players, those who decide investment, those who decide to buy a house, to buy a car, to have children, and so on and so forth, and who really don't know what will be the landscape when it comes to tax and when it comes to public spending. So the uncertainty that looms over those decision makers, whether very at the most domestic level or higher, is a cause of lack of confidence in the system. And from a more macroeconomic point of view, our assessment is that it will entail a reduction of 4% of the US deficit, which is good news in a way. It's very brutal, and as a result, the bad news is that it would have a contracting effect on the growth of the United States that we estimate to be in the range of 2%. When you know that our forecast for the growth of the United States is also in the range of 2%, you see the trouble that that could create if it was not resolved rapidly. And there is no certainty that it will be resolved rapidly. It's clearly closely related to political dilemmas, uncertainties, and just as the Eurozone has had its lot of uncertainties and still has some, probably to a more limited extent than it did, the United States of America is also dealing with great uncertainty between what the executive would like to see through and what the legislative is not prepared to accept. So that's the situation for the advanced economies. Very quickly, it does have an effect on the emerging markets. You can see that when you compare the forecast for, say, Brazil, India, to a lesser degree China, although the expected growth rate has been revised downwards. But if the spillover effects can actually explain, in a large measure, the reduction of forecast for growth for those emerging market economies, there are also some domestic realities that operate as a brake on the growth of those emerging market economies. And clearly we will be watching India, for instance, very carefully, because there are reforms underway, corporate reforms, competition reform, retail market reforms that might unleash a degree of domestic growth that could counterbalance the reduced growth that results from the external demand addressed to India. This is particularly interesting because India is clearly not a huge export machine and relies heavily on a domestic market that has a very significant population dividend, workforce dividend that is coming up now. But for those countries, clearly our signal in terms of recommended policies is to really sort of try to rebalance not only the traditional rebalancing act that we expect from those countries in surplus, but a rebalancing of the growth model in order to be more relying on domestic engines, if you will, rather than the trade engine, and to be less exposed to external vulnerability factors. Looking at the low-income countries, they're probably in the whole group those that have fared the better, who have, in the main, for most of them actually, have used their buffers to protect against the crisis back in 2009, and which have to rebuild those buffers whenever they can afford it, and when the growth that they have, which is in the range of 5.5% to 6%, depending on whether you look at sub-Saharan Africa or some of the Asian countries coupled with them. But those growth levels would allow them certainly to reconstitute those buffers to react to external shocks. It's not the case for all of them, because some of them are subject to commodity volatility, food prices issues that exposes them, and where they cannot reconstitute buffers. And in which case our policy advice is to try to focus whatever fiscal space they still have on the poorest and on the spending on health and education, for instance. I've tried to gallop through that, and I can tell you now three things. Because I have now been doing this job for a little over a year, and first of all, I'm very proud of the institution. I'm very proud of the staff members who work for the IMF. I have to tell you that, when you are the chairman of a big international law firm, you see lots of very, very dedicated people who at the end of the month, at the end of the year, end up with nice compensation packages. Not necessarily the case, and certainly not to the same extent at the IMF, but those people who work with me, who I work with, are probably more dedicated, more engaged, more determined, and more prepared to sacrifice a lot of sometimes their private and family life to actually serve the cause of the IMF and serve the membership. So, number one, I'm very, very proud of them and very proud of the job that we do. I'm very concerned that we continue consistently to be relevant to the membership and to make sure that we continue to be trusted advisor and as independent as is possible from any group within the membership, in order to give that independent advice that is valued. Not easy to give, not easy to receive, but sometimes we had to make judgment calls and just go public on some of the advice that we thought was required. I think that we have made sure that the instruments we have had evolved over time, and I'll take a couple of examples. You remember that 3 years ago, these flexible credit lines were put in place, which were aimed at supporting countries where the policy mix was fine, but where the threats, particularly from external factors, could expose those economies. That has been very successful. We now have Mexico, Colombia, and Poland using those flexible credit lines. Equally, we had to sort of reconfigure, in a way, some of the instruments that we thought we could be using, such as the precautionary credit line, which has had very little success, and turn it into a precautionary and liquidity, I'm afraid to say, in front of central bankers or former central bankers credit line. And that has been most useful, in particular in the Middle East, where we have been able to help countries like Morocco or like Jordan, or like Yemen. Yemen used a different facility, but we just have to adjust the facilities that we use depending on circumstances, showing the same degree of rigor and of vigor to both, expect conditionalities or be able to assess policies that are used by any particular country. Couple of things that I'm particularly proud of this year. the fact that we were able to raise resources significantly. Algeria yesterday came up with another $5 billion, so we now have 461 additional $1 billion to have really a consistent volume of funds should we have to use them for